October 27, 1962. 250 feet below the surface of the Sargasso Sea, the air inside Soviet submarine B-59 has gone thick and sour. The batteries are almost dead. The temperature in the engine room has passed 140 degrees. Men are fainting at their posts. Above the hull, American destroyers are dropping explosives meant to force the submarine up, not to sink it. Nobody on board knows that. The captain believes the war has already started. He orders his men to arm a nuclear torpedo. Under Soviet naval procedure, that weapon cannot fire on his word alone. 2 other officers have to agree. One of them refuses. His name was Vasili Arkhipov, and for 40 years, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet naval officers knew what he had done, or that the rest of us were still here because of it. Arkhipov was born in January 1926 in a village called Staraya Kupovna, outside Moscow, to a family of farmers. He went to naval school at 16, saw the last months of the Second World War as a young officer on a minesweeper in the Pacific, and spent the years afterward working his way up through submarines in the Black Sea, Northern and Baltic fleets. By the standards of the Soviet officer corps, nothing about his early career marked him as extraordinary. He was competent, reliable, unremarkable on paper. Then, in the summer of 1961, he was assigned as executive officer of a new ballistic missile submarine, K-19, the Soviet Navy's first nuclear-powered vessel to carry nuclear missiles, and a boat so accident-prone that the sailors who served on it would later call it, without affection, Hiroshima. On July 4, 1961, K-19's reactor cooling system failed on a training patrol in the North Atlantic. Without repair, the reactor core would melt down, and by some estimates might have detonated with something close to the force of a small nuclear weapon, within reach of a NATO base. There was no backup system. The engineers who volunteered to fix it had to stand in the reactor compartment, in radiation many times a lethal dose, and weld a replacement cooling loop by hand. They stopped the meltdown. 7 of them were dead within a month. More than a dozen other crew members would die of radiation-related illness over the following 2 decades. Arkhipov, as executive officer, spent the crisis moving through a boat where men were vomiting from radiation sickness and morale was collapsing, holding the crew together well enough that no one refused an order and no one panicked into a mistake that might have killed them all faster. He himself absorbed a dose of radiation that Soviet doctors would not fully disclose to him. This is the man who, 15 months later, found himself on a second submarine, in a second crisis, with the stakes raised from one crew of soldiers to the rest of the world. In the autumn of 1962, the Soviet Union began a secret operation to install nuclear missiles 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The public story is the one most people already know. The discovery of the missile sites, the American naval blockade, the 13 days of brinkmanship between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Underneath that story, largely absent from it for the next 40 years, was a second operation almost nobody in the West even suspected. 4 Soviet diesel submarines, each one carrying, alongside its conventional torpedoes, a single nuclear torpedo with a warhead roughly the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Arkhipov, now Chief of Staff of the brigade, sailed aboard one of them, submarine B-59, not as its commanding officer, but as the senior officer of the flotilla present on board. That distinction would turn out to matter more than almost anyone involved could have guessed. The submarine's own captains did not know their final destination until they had already put to sea. They sailed through a hurricane that battered 3 of the 4 boats. They crossed into water far warmer than anything their Arctic-built vessels were designed for. Temperatures inside some compartments passed 120 degrees. Fresh water was rationed to a cup a man. Refrigeration failed. Skin rashes and heat exhaustion spread through crews already worn down by weeks at sea. And because Soviet naval communications with Moscow grew less and less reliable, the farther the boats traveled, the men on board B-59 were, for long stretches, cut off from any word of what was actually happening between Washington and the Kremlin. They did know, from monitoring open American radio broadcasts, that a crisis was underway. What they could not know, submerged and battered and running out of air, was how close it had come to resolution, or how close it was in that same hour to catastrophe. By the morning of October 27th, a day American planners would later call Black Saturday, the most dangerous single day of the entire crisis, a group of U.S. Navy ships had located B-59 and begun dropping practice depth charges, small explosives intended as a signal, surface and be identified. Nobody had told the Soviet crew what those explosions meant. To men who had been submerged for most of a day, air running out, unable to raise Moscow, and aware that a nuclear war might already be underway on the surface, they sounded like the opening of an attack. Captain Valentin Savitsky, exhausted and half suffocated by the bad air, reportedly told his officers that war had started while they sat helpless underwater, and gave the order to ready the nuclear torpedo for firing. The weapon, once armed, would need the concurrence of 3 men to launch. Savitsky, the boat's political officer, Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov, and Arkhipov, whose rank as flotilla chief of staff gave him an equal voice in the decision, despite not commanding the vessel itself. According to the only detailed account of what followed, reconstructed decades later from a fellow officer's recollection, Savitsky and Maslenikov were prepared to fire. Arkhipov was not. He argued that the explosions detonating around the hull, not against it, were not the pattern of a real attack, and that no order to use nuclear weapons could be justified without confirmation from Moscow that the 2 nations were, in fact, at war. He pressed for the submarine to surface and attempt to make contact rather than fire blind. B-59 surfaced into a ring of American searchlights and jazz music being broadcast from a nearby destroyer, meant, absurdly, as a friendly signal. Savitsky radioed that the vessel belonged to the Soviet Union and demanded an end to what he called provocative actions. He received an apology. The submarine withdrew. No weapon was fired. It should be said plainly here, because the story is often told as though it were simple. It was not solely Arkhipov's decision to make, and the full record of what was said in that control room exists in only one man's memory, given to a journalist decades after the fact. What is well documented is that the vessel carried a live nuclear weapon, that its senior officers disagreed sharply about using it, and that it was not used. B-59 and the rest of the brigade turned north for home, through the same Atlantic storms, arriving at their base on the Kola Peninsula in the last days of December, in the middle of a blizzard, on Christmas Eve. There was no celebration. Soviet command was furious that the submarines had been detected and forced to the surface at all, a failure of the mission's secrecy, regardless of what had been prevented. The crews were confined to their boats under guard while an investigation began. The brigade commander was relieved and never given another posting. Captain Savitsky's later career effectively ended. Several accounts describe him as a broken man for the rest of his life over what had happened and over what very nearly had. Arkhipov continued serving. He would go on to command his own submarine, later rise to rear admiral and then vice admiral, and eventually take charge of the Kirov Naval Academy before retiring in the mid-1980s. He did not speak publicly about October 27, 1962, in any detail for the rest of his life. His own family, by his daughter's later account, knew almost nothing of it. It was classified information, and he treated it as such to the end. The story surfaced only in 2002, at a conference in Havana marking the crisis's 40th anniversary, when a former Soviet intelligence officer who had served aboard B-59, Vadim Orlov, gave the first detailed public account of what had happened in that control room. The account historians still rely on today, because it is essentially the only one. Thomas Blanton, then director of the U.S. National Security Archive, who had spent years working to declassify Cold War records from both sides, would later describe Archipov's refusal in 5 words that stuck: a man who saved the world. There's a complication in this story that a serious accounting of it has to include. 5 years before Orlov's account became public, in 1997, Arkhipov himself gave the only public statement he ever made about that day, at a private Cuban Missile Crisis retrospective. In it, he does not describe vetoing a launch order at all. He describes Savitsky as disoriented and half-blinded by the explosions and searchlights above the conning tower, and says that within a couple of minutes it became clear the Americans were firing past the boat, not at it, after which, in his telling, the confusion simply resolved itself. He does not mention his own veto. He seems, if anything, irritated at the growing legend, which by then had started circulating in Russian military journals, viewing it as an attempt to make Soviet officers look reckless or unstable. Arkhipov died the following year, in August 1998, of kidney cancer that several accounts connect to the radiation dose he absorbed on K 1937 years earlier. He never lived to see his name become known outside Russia, and never corrected in public, whichever version of the story people eventually settled on. Historians who have studied both accounts alongside the surviving Soviet documentation generally agree on this much. A nuclear torpedo was aboard B-59. Its use required consensus among 3 officers, not 1. The men disagreed about whether to use it, and it was not used. Beyond that point, the story runs on a single memory, filtered through a journalist, released decades after the fact, and never confirmed by the one man in the best position to confirm or deny it before it was too late to ask him. There is a question this story raises that has nothing to do with who deserves the credit. For a few hours on October 27, 1962, the decision to end organized life across much of the planet rested on 3 men who had not slept properly in days, who were breathing air thick with carbon dioxide, and who believed, reasonably, given how little they actually knew, that they might already be fighting a war that had started somewhere above them without their knowledge. The rule, requiring all three to agree, was designed as a safeguard against exactly that kind of pressure. It held this once, only because one of the three reasoned differently from the other two, under conditions engineered to produce panic rather than judgment. Nothing about Savitsky's or Maslenikov's readiness to fire looks like cowardice. If anything, it was the opposite, a willingness to die and to kill, rather than back down from what they believed was already war. That may be the more dangerous instinct to hand a nuclear weapon to. Whether any launch authority should ever depend on the judgment of exhausted men cut off from their own chain of command, rather than on distance, delay, and independent confirmation, is a question the crisis left open. Military planners still argue about it today. What remains certain is this. On a day the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at almost any other point in the 20th century, a small group of exhausted men in a steel tube beneath the Sargasso Sea had, between them, the physical ability to end the world, and did not use it. Whether that was the deliberate act of one officer standing alone against two others, or a fear shared and worked through by three men together under an unbearable weight of uncertainty, the outcome was the same, and it was the only outcome any of us could afford. Vasili Arkhipov never asked to be remembered for it. For most of his life he was not. His daughter and grandson accepted an award in his name in London in 2017. 19 years after he had died, still believing, as far as anyone can tell, that the story belonged buried with the rest of what he'd been ordered never to discuss.